everybody. Welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner, practitioner, and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. On today's episode, I wrap up this series on risk management and talk about asset protection for optometrists. That is, protecting your family and the assets that you've worked so hard to build from liability. And in this conversation, I'm joined by Levi Barlavi, an attorney and owner of Pacific Health Law Group in Southern California. Levi and I dive into what is asset protection and the different types of risks that you face as an optometrist. We talk about the different ways to protect your assets, from simple tools like insurance to different legal entities and structures. We talk about ways to make sure that you're maintaining the legal structures in your life so liability can't pierce their protection and reach your personal assets, or what we'd call piercing the corporate veil. And lastly, for practice owners, we have a discussion on how to protect the value of your business as an asset from the big what-ifs that can happen to you, as well as preserving the value through a successful transition. And this was a fun conversation for me, and asset protection sounds like it's something that only the ultra high net worth people need to be concerned about. But the reality is, you face these risks as an optometrist, and you'll hear in the episode, it doesn't take crazy, complex, costly things to start protecting yourself. Sometimes it's just simple steps that can really make a huge difference. So hopefully you enjoy the episode. If you have any questions or thoughts about future episode topics, reach out to me at Evon, EVON at optometrywealth.com. You can find all of the links and resources mentioned in the show notes at the Education Hub on my website, www.optometrywealth.com/education. And while you're there, feel free to schedule a no commitment introductory call, and we can talk about whatever's on your mind financially, and you can learn about how we serve optometrists all over the country. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Levi Barlavi. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, and I am excited to welcome another special guest today. And today we have Levi Barlavi of Pacific Health Law Group. Levi, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Evon. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate you making time to chat today.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk with you about what I feel is an important topic, and I think you do too, and that's asset protection for optometrists. And over the last several episodes, maybe over the last month or so, I've kind of had a theme about risk management. I had a few episodes about life insurance protection. We had an episode about estate planning, and now I think that natural next step is to talk about asset protection. And we'll dive into what that even means and who is it for and all the different things to consider as a part of optometrists protecting themselves and their net worth. But before we dive into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little bit about your background and tell us about your firm.
Yeah, so I am a healthcare transactional attorney. So I assist entrepreneurial doctors in their practice startups, acquisitions, and sales. So throughout their professional career, as they enter big transactions that require review of contracts or a consultation with an attorney to assist with the deal, I'm there to help my clients. All my clients are doctors, providers, mostly optometrists, dentists, veterinarians. And then we assist them with corporate formation, partnerships, review of the lease agreement. When they're looking to buy a practice, we assist them with the legal documents throughout that transaction. When they're looking to sell, we assist them with that. And we do a lot of private equity deals more now with companies who are looking to partner up with doctors. So that's a little bit about what I do. I've been doing it for 15 years. So I started about 15 years ago, and I've done about 1,000 transactions to date. So 700 just transitions, 300 startups over that time. And yeah, happy to chat with you. Whatever wisdom I can impart through all those experiences.
I'm sure with all those transactions, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of wisdom here. And so when you think about the words asset protection, like what does that even mean? Is it something that only the ultra wealthy should be considering? If someone were to, I doubt anyone's, come and talk to you and said, hey, I need some asset protection. So when you think about what that means, if you're going to explain it to an optometrist for the first time, how would you explain it?
Yeah, not to try to use the same words, but basically what we're trying to do anytime we're doing asset protection is to prevent our personal assets, our home, our bank accounts, our vehicles, anything that we own from being touched if there's a liability out there. So that would include litigation, right? Lawsuits. And so if there's something that's going to cause some sort of judgment against us, how do we protect our personal assets and separate them from our business assets so that those business liabilities don't potentially flow over and touch our personal assets? And that's basically the gist of it. And it's done in many different ways. Happy to go into more detail.
Yeah. So the goal then is to, wherever liability exists, to protect whatever other assets you have that are not specifically tied to that liability. And the way I've heard it described, just our legal system today, is that it's much easier to bring a lawsuit if you are bringing a lawsuit against someone else. It's much easier to find an attorney that will work on contingency, meaning you don't have to pay them up front. And then if you're defending that same lawsuit, it's much more expensive because the way I've heard it described, and you can tell me otherwise, it's harder to find attorneys that work on contingency. So you do have to put up dollars up front in order to defend a lot of these things, not including the time that goes into that. So lawsuits can be very expensive, and it seems like it's much more heavily weighed against the defendant than it is for the one bringing up the lawsuit. And like, where do these liabilities come from? I mean, just thinking through my mind, like there's stuff on the personal side. There's kids, teenagers driving cars and getting in accidents. There's you getting in an accident and someone looking you up and you're an optometrist, a successful business owner. Like there's all these things on the personal side, but where do you see that liability coming up? Where are the sources of that liability?
Yeah. So just to unpack that a little bit, we certainly live in a country where anyone has a right to bring an allegation against us in the form of a lawsuit. And it's fairly simple to at least file a complaint and start that process. So, liability can come from anywhere, right? So we carry a lot of potential risk and potential liability in our practice as an owner, right? We're employer, so there's potential employment liability in terms of, if we fire someone or if we don't follow wage and hour rules, or potential sexual harassment claims. There's liabilities in terms of the patient care we provide, right? So that's considered professional liability, malpractice liability. And then there's potential liabilities within the office to third parties. Someone who comes in the office, slips and falls, has an injury unrelated to the care that we're providing, right? And then you step outside of the office, right? There's liability potentially everywhere. You get into a car accident, or your dog bites someone walking down the street, or someone comes into your house as a guest and something happens to them in your house. So, we live in a world where there's always potential for accidents. And in our legal system, there's a cause of action for negligence where someone can bring a lawsuit to claim for damages if any of those things potentially occur.
Interesting. And unfortunately, it seems like we live in a litigious society that's quick to jump to those legal actions pretty quickly, unfortunately. And it can be not only time consuming, but very expensive, even if you're not at fault and having to defend yourself. So what is at risk then? Is it personal assets? If it's personal liability, professional liability, there's liability within the practice. Like what's actually at risk?
Yeah. So the best way to think about this is, anytime you're an actor in the world and you cause some sort of potential damages to someone else, they can come back to you for restitution to get compensated for the injury or the harm that was caused. Now, the question becomes is what can they go after, right? And the answer to that is wholly dependent on how you've arranged your life. Okay. So if you own your optometric practice personally in your name, then if you do something in that practice and there's a harm to that individual, they can potentially touch anything that's in your name, right? And so that's why we try to separate our practice from ourselves individually by owning it through a corporation. And by owning our business assets through that corporation, we have potentially set the first kind of shield up, if we did it the right way, to protect ourselves, protect our home and our personal assets from any liabilities that trail from our business assets.
Can income be included as a part of that as well? Can future income, for example, like how can income be tied to that liability, if it can at all?
It can. And so, the way to kind of look at this is, your assets include any kind of personal property you might own, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a business, that would include your furniture, your fixtures, your equipment, your cash on hand, your accounts receivable, potentially the income that you earn. Personally, that might include your house, your car, your jewelry, right? Any other personal investment properties that you might own, retirement, cash accounts, and bank accounts. And so any of those assets potentially can be touched if there's a liability created because of something you've done in your business or personally. And so then the question becomes, what's the best measure for us in a cost-efficient way to do what we can to protect ourselves, to provide those asset protection mechanisms to prevent, someone coming after all of our assets?
Let's dive into that then. If someone and I guess first let's look at it through the lens of any optometrist, whether they're owning a practice or not. How would you talk to them about how to think about protecting their assets? Like what does asset protection look like from your point of view?
So it's a multitude of potential options, right? And they're not mutually exclusive. Most wealthy people do a whole range of these. One of them, the easiest one is kind of, being a good actor, right? Having systems in place that mitigate the chance of you doing dumb things in your practice, right? Being compliant with rules and regulations and making sure you have audit systems so that you're looking at your insurance billing every once in a while and you're making sure that the biller is submitting those bills correctly, right? Working with a payroll team, HR team to set up your payroll right, so you're paying employees right. So those are just kind of, making smart decisions, working with a consultant to help set up your practice and operate in a way that you're not going to make a lot of mistakes that will lead to potential risk and liabilities.
Yeah.
A second one. Yeah.
I guess avoiding the risk is sometimes the easiest way to
avoiding the risk.
Right?
Yeah.
And that can go on a wide range of things, right? Not having deadly types of dogs or, not having certain things done at the house to avoid that. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
What was that second step you were going into?
So the second one is to hedge against these risks. And that would be through insurance. We would, insurance is a obligation that you pay for each month that covers potential issues that may arise in different parts of your life, right? So there's multitude of different insurances that you can have. You can have business operating insurance to protect you against lawsuits. You can have employer liability insurance to protect you against potential employee lawsuits, right? You can have personal umbrella insurance that protects your house and your home. You can have auto insurance when you're driving. So there's a whole host of number of insurances. And for your business, you can even have overhead insurance that would pay your overhead, including your rent, in case the business is shut down for a number of months for something that you did in the business by accident,
Mm.
right? So that's a different layer of protection to mitigate the chance of risk of any potential lawsuit. And that is, I think, even as an attorney who sets up corporations all the time for my clients for their businesses, I think the easiest way for us to protect ourselves is to get adequate insurance that will cover us. And then again, it's not just set it and forget it. As you grow in the practice and as your wealth grows, you should have a yearly checkup, right, with your broker, with your financial advisor to make sure we have adequate coverage in our personal life and in our business life so that we're mitigating those chances of risk and we have rich care, take care of those potential liabilities.
Mm. So you've avoid the risks that you can. Don't do dumb things. Maybe is rule number one, right?
Yep.
The second and easiest layer is insurance, and I think you're right there. I think that's a huge way to take certain risks off of your shoulders and place that onto an insurance company, who can manage that risk a lot better by pulling it with a whole bunch of other people. And let's talk about types of insurance, because you mentioned there's certain insurances specifically in a business that protect from the things that can happen in that business. But then you mentioned a few others. You mentioned personal liability insurance. So I would say that's your home and auto insurance would be the first layer to that. Those have certain liability coverage limits. And then you mentioned umbrella insurance. Talk to us about what umbrella insurance is.
So umbrella insurance is a type of insurance that sits on top of your other personal liability insurances, like your home and auto policy, that is basically your line of defense against other things that might happen in your life. And so it provides a secondary, basically, coverage in case your insurances, for instance, auto gets, the damage is more than your limits, your umbrella insurance would cover that.
Got it. And from just what I've seen, like this is probably the insurance that's lacking the most, just because optometrists don't know about it, and it's not something that's commonly talked about. They hear more about the disability insurance and life insurance, which are all important, but this is also one of the things that the price to value is probably the best of all insurance. Like it's relatively inexpensive to get a pretty decently high amount of umbrella coverage, and you would want to make sure that your home and auto limits are high enough to get up to the umbrella coverage, so there's no gaps there in between the two. But one of the things that's interesting for me to think through, and that I talk to my peers a lot, and I'd love to hear your thoughts of, is that, at the risk of trying to give legal advice on a podcast, like how should optometrists think about how much umbrella liability insurance is appropriate for them? How would you think through that, just sort of as a framework to think through what's appropriate and
So
what's not?
this is certainly not a one-size-fits-all conversation. Yeah. And so I really do think, as optometry, as you graduate and you go into the real world and you start working, and then it's get married, start a family, maybe buy a house, buy a practice in no particular order. Everyone does things maybe differently. But for most people, you go along that path and you're accumulating in that process more and more wealth. I think it's very important, and I think you would agree, to work with a financial advisor, someone who understands your financial picture and what your goals are and what your appetite is, right? Mm. And determines how much you have in terms of wealth and obligations, right? If you have a young mother, a young dad of three, you have more at risk potentially than if your kids are older and they're working and they have their own income streams now. So, those type of questions and answers are really best tied, and you give me your thoughts, to someone who understands your financial picture. Yeah. The best.
Yeah, I'm a little biased, but I would say having a good financial advisor is important. But just having the people in your life, an advisor is a part of that. Maybe the most proactive person, but these other professionals, having good attorneys and tax professionals, insurance brokers that know you and that have a good idea about what's going on in your life and work together helps to solve some of these things, because you're right. I kind of put you in a tough spot there. There is no one size fits all answer to that question. It really is, what are the different risks in your own life? What assets do you have? And what is your comfort level with the amount of insurance you need? For every optometrist in your particular state, Levi and I, we're in California here. In every particular state, and certain assets federally have certain exemptions too, where they're protected up to some levels from certain things like bankruptcy protection, legal liability. So take a look at your assets and talk to your own professionals and say, what's actually protected. And one example of that is ERISA plans, like 401k plans, are extremely well protected federally.
Yeah. Another one is, a lot of, the FDIC protects bank accounts up to a certain amount.
Right.
Federal deposits. So I think it's 250,000. Your first 250 is protected, insured by the FDIC. So we saw that last year with some banks going under, that, the government does protect a certain amount of your bank account. So another reason to work with an advisor to see, where is there gaps in potential coverage, where there are risk, and you have to either move your money or set it up in another way that you're most protected.
Right. And even things like solo 401ks, which if you're self-employed, independent contractors, you have a solo 401k plan with no employees, those are not ERISA plans and do not have that same coverage. Things like IRAs have specific coverage based on your state rather than federal law, different from bankruptcy too. So just take a look at your own assets and ask yourself, okay, what types of assets do I have? And then talk to your professionals and say what's exempted and what's not, and how much insurance do you need. And an interesting part of that too is something that you mentioned, is that as assets grow, like you're kind of protecting yourself with insurance at a certain state in life. And then you have to review it as things grow, right? Because things will change.
Yeah. So it's an evolving conversation. It's like when I set up, potentially partnerships in practices starting out, it's a living kind of document. I always, caution my clients that you should check in 5 years and see, have the parameters of the partnership changed, so that you would need to change the actual agreement. Same with your financial picture. Hopefully you'll see your wealth continue to grow. That should prompt you to think twice and revisit what you've set up in the beginning and see if there needs to be any tweaks to your protection plan.
Right. And then you mentioned malpractice liability too. So optometrists probably will have a malpractice insurance, but you want to make sure that that's appropriate, and the type of malpractice insurance is appropriate as well. That's one of those rare areas where your work in the business, if you own a practice, actually will go beyond your practice into your personal assets with that professional liability. Let's talk now about entities, right? And this is maybe your bread and butter here. And those that own practices, or even those that own other assets like real estate, where do these legal entities now start to come into play and become an important part about protecting someone's net worth?
Yeah. So a legal entity is a corporation, an LLC, or other type of corporate form that is allowed under California and other states, that has rights to it and can, operate a business and own assets and has to file tax returns. And it's an entity separate from you. And so the reason you want to own your practice, not every optometrist should have a corporation set up while they're working. I'm not one of those attorneys who always recommends that you have to do this, because there's a cost to it and you might not need it. But once you purchase a practice or start a practice and you're now acquiring assets, it's a really good idea to own your practice through an entity. Most states have regulations in terms of what, as a professional healthcare provider, what type of entity is available to you. So for instance, here in California, you can only own an optometry practice through a California professional corporation, in this case, an optometric corporation. That's a type of corporation that has specialized rules in terms of the naming, who can own the corp, in terms of the ownership structure, and how it's operated. And so, the first thing we want to do is make sure we have the right entity, right, owning the practice. I see a lot of doctors who will go on and set up LLCs, limited liability companies,
Interesting.
and you cannot own and practice optometry through an LLC here in California.
Yeah.
And then there's other types of entities that you can use if you own the real estate, for instance. When you own the real estate that your practice is located at, you can own it in different types of entities, including a corporation or a limited liability company. And that's just a conversation you're going to have with your attorney in terms of what's the best fit for you in terms of that situation.
Mm. Yeah. And so in terms of the on the business side, like you mentioned, like if you're just practicing as an employed optometrist or maybe even as an independent contractor, perhaps you don't need that corporation to protect yourself. You're going to have that malpractice insurance, hopefully the umbrella insurance side of it, but it's really where you're now going to own a business and you're going to have a functioning business to where, okay, this really makes sense. This is where that corporation steps in. Or in other states, it could be an LLC, depending on what your state allows, to contain whatever stuff can happen in that business within the assets of that business. And one thing I'll say, if you're in a state that allows LLCs, a lot of times you'll hear things on social media about how you can do all these LLC tricks to save on taxes and all that. LLCs are not tax saving vehicles. It's purely about the liability. You can do other things that can potentially help you save taxes. You can choose to be taxed differently, but by default, your LLC is going to be purely about liability protection, right? It's not this magical tax wand to wave around. But
That's right.
In terms of the real estate, I think this is interesting because you have some practice owners that will purchase the practice real estate. You have others that are purchasing other types of rental properties, whether it's long-term rentals, Airbnbs, whatever it may be. Again, at risk of trying to put you on a spot where you're giving legal advice on a podcast, like how can one think about whether it makes sense to have an LLC versus just having appropriate insurance, whether it makes sense to have multiple LLCs for each rental property versus one? Like, are there any general guidelines? Probably not. I should say, like, talk to your attorney, please, optometrist. This is just a podcast.
I'm happy to tell you my thoughts on this. Remember, for your practice ownership, this is not a question. You're limited by your state's rules on professional entities, whether that's here in California, a professional corporation. Some other states have PLLCs, which is a different type of entity. You're limited. If you're a real estate investor, the question of whether you own the entity in an LLC or you put multiple entities in one LLC is really a matter of how much risk you want to take on versus how risk adverse you are. The reason why, a lot of, millionaires and billionaires own every one of their real estate properties under a different LLC is for the same reasons that we just discussed. If one LLC owns that property, whatever is happening in that building in terms of management or operations or lawsuits, that building is now protected from the other building that's owned by a completely separate limited liability company. And so the reason to hold each asset in a different LLC is just to separate those assets so that the liabilities don't cross over and touch each other.
Got it. Interesting. And that I would assume is especially important if it's the practice owner owning the commercial real estate that the practice resides on. And I've actually seen a couple of scenarios where the practice owner didn't really know at the time otherwise, and they were getting an SBA loan, and it was all sort of packaged in with the practice that they were starting as well as the real estate. So they figured, okay, I'm just going to own it all under the same entity. It's the real estate's going to be owned under the practice entity, and especially if you have other tenants, like you're opening now your practice assets to the liability of the real estate and vice versa. So I think what you said is so important.
I'm dealing with all of this right now, actually, because what we're seeing 2-3 years after the pandemic is that a lot of the people who took those EIDL loans, the EIDL loans, who are now looking to sell their practice, didn't realize that those practices now have a lien on them by the SBA. And when you sell your practice, you have to sell it without any liens. Otherwise, the buyer's bank will not loan the money on those liens. And so this has tripped up a lot of sellers who didn't anticipate they're going to have to pay those loans back on the closing of the deal. And if they're on the underwater on the practice, it's become very problematic for them.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting to think through. And you know, if especially if your practice then becomes taxed as an S corporation, it can be messy to try to pull that real estate out for tax purposes. So I think what you said is so important, is looking at these different assets and saying, okay, how can I then protect each other as well as your personal net worth, but how can you protect each of them from each other through these different entities, business versus the real estate versus the others. And I'd love to ask you about like piercing the veil. And, you know, I've seen enough profit and loss statements to see that some practice owners will have plenty of personal expenses, accidentally or not accidentally, running through the business. You know, there's at times corporate formalities to keep, especially if you're a corporation. Who knows how relaxed the real estate owner is in the way that they keep their LLC. So what does it mean for liability to pierce the veil of that entity or pierce the corporate veil? And how can an optometrist protect themselves from doing that and maintain all this stuff appropriately?
Without getting too legal or using too much legalese, basically, when you set up a corporation, that's your first step in operating and protecting your assets through separating your assets into different entities. For a lot of people, it's the last step. It's all that they do. But in order to properly have that corporate protection, you have to do a few things. You have to keep that corporation separate from your life personally. And what that means is the corporation has its own bank accounts and your personal bank accounts are separate from the corporate ones. And you don't mix up those assets, that cash, into one account. The corporation has to be run through a series of rules, including its bylaws, and then the directors of that corporation and the officers have to make decisions and make those decisions in writing through the corporate minutes. So there's a governance regulation, program that you have to have in terms of running the corporation like a corporation does in order to have the protections that a corporation has. And so yes, you see a lot of doctors make a lot of mistakes here. And so the pro tip here is, first of all, don't commingle your assets, right? Don't commingle your personal assets with your corporate bank account and just switch money back and forth. There should be a very clean record keeping of what payments are going for the corporation. And if there's any personal expenses paid through the corporation, you have to run those through a tax specialist to make sure that these are reasonable expenses that you can, in fact, justify paying through the corporation. And then the last bit of advice is you want to make sure that you're compliant. So make sure that you're voting for officers every year, voting for directors every year, and then you work with an attorney to maintain your what we call minutes or just notes of large activities and decisions being made. And those are held in that corporate book that is collecting dust somewhere on a shelf when you set up the corporation.
Yeah, that's helpful. Treat them like businesses. They'll treat them like the protection will only go as far as how seriously you treat this as the business it is. And it sounds like that would include these rental property entities as well, of proper accounting, separation of the finances, and making sure that it's kept up appropriately as the compliance is needed. So, which is important. I mean, the whole reason anyone is setting these entities up is for that protection. And if you're not doing the things you need to do to keep that protection up, then what's the point of it, right? So I appreciate you sharing that. And I have a couple little slightly different questions to ask you in a different direction here, but on a similar theme. So it sounds like from what we've talked about here, there's different ways to handle protecting yourself and your assets from from that legal liability. And that's, can be as simple as using exemptions and insurance. Using insurance can be a good way to start and take care of that. And as your life changes, as you're working with your professionals, as things grow and change, then you can add on top of it with these other things like legal entities and stuff as needed. But it doesn't need to be this big complicated thing that only the ultra wealthy do, right? It can be pretty simple, or even as simple as not doing the dumb stuff and trying to avoid the risks where you can, and just watching your own actions. I'd like to ask about protecting an asset, if for the practice owners, protecting their asset, the value of their business, but not from legal liability, but just would love to hear your thoughts on protecting the value of that business from the big what ifs that can happen. And we may not have time to go into a big, long discussion on this, but just sort of some general thoughts on, okay, the owner owns the business. They have this asset that's now growing. Maybe it's been quite profitable for several years. It's got some real value to it. What are some of the what ifs that they should be thinking about, the contingencies that they need to plan for, so that if something happened, they can protect the value, maintain the value of that business?
This is a great question. And I'll tell you, in our personal lives, anyone who has a family who works with a financial advisor has been told that you need to have an estate plan in case of your death, right? And that would protect your personal assets, right? What happens to your house, your bank accounts, your personal assets? How are those things taken care of upon your death? What many people and most optometrists, most doctors fail to do is have a contingency plan. And that's your contingency plan for your personal life. But they fail to have a contingency plan for their practice in case something serious happens to them. And after doing this for, 15 years, unfortunately, I've had to be involved in a number of practice sales where the selling optometrist passes on unexpectedly. And typically, the value of the practice drops precipitously the longer it's on the market after the optometrist has passed away. So, creating a contingency plan is the best thing to do. And you can keep it pretty simple, right? You have to have someone, usually the office manager, have a sheet of paper that they can go to with all the critical information they need to help guide the practice through a tragic event like this, right? And so on that, I would include the name of a practice broker that they can call immediately, right? Either the optometrist partner, wife, husband can call someone. The name of an attorney that they call that can help them through this process. The practice manager, and where are critical documents located in the practice? Where is your lease agreement located? Where are your financial tax returns for the practice located? This is information that the practice broker will need to help get the practice sold. And then also, what contingencies do you have in place to help the practice manage, while your partner is grieving, right? And this might include having a relationship with another local optometrist that you guys agree to take care of each other in case of a serious situation where someone could step in 1 day a week or 2 days a week at least as a locus tenens to cover for you in this situation. So, something that you can put into place in a one-page document with critical information, login information that you can give to your spouse that can at least start the ball rolling is key to help yourself in a situation like this.
Yeah. And right. So what's happening, right? You're not available. The owner or doctor are not available to serve patients. That means that the practice isn't earning revenue. The longer that goes, patients are going elsewhere, less likely to come back. And thinking through that relationship with other doctors, if it's a sole OD practice and they're the only ones in the practice, would that be like a formal agreement, like a written document that's signed, a contract, or is it simply a handshake? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, I know this is funny to hear from an attorney, but it's usually a handshake with a colleague that you've known for a long time.
Okay.
That, your spouse could give you a call. I haven't actually had some sort of written agreement with another OD that can step in, but it's usually that. And again, especially it's in thinking about this, it's good to think about your practice as a business.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be too completely reliant on you.
Right.
You should have systems in place that has a practice operate by itself if you are not there, right? What do you have in place when you go out on vacation for a week or 2 weeks? You have to have systems in place, including potentially thinking about having an associate start coming to your practice and grow it to the point where that the professional services aren't completely on your shoulders, so that there's an associate in there to provide coverage opportunity.
Yeah, that associate can be an important part of de-risking that practice, of taking that reliance, like you mentioned, taking that reliance of the day-to-day off of your shoulders and allowing it to be this machine that can run even if you weren't there, can go a long way in preserving that value. And how does that change if there are two owners, co-owners in a practice? How does that change?
Well, this becomes much, there's a lot of downside to being in a partnership, and that's a whole nother conversation. But this is one of the upsides of being in a partnership. If you're in a partnership, there's a natural contingency plan in place in the partnership agreement in case one of the doctors dies, including, what steps the practice is going to take to compensate the deceased doctor's family for the equity that that doctor has, whether that's backed up by an insurance payment or the practice has cash on hand to buy out that doctor's equity.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of insurance, like if the business is needing to bring on, like in your death or disability, if the business needs to bring on another doctor to work there, there are insurance policies like disability overhead insurance that can provide some amount for hiring of staff or doctors to come in. So insurance can have a place there, but I think it's those relationships of trying to build the relationships maybe with local doctors is an interesting solution to there. If you're the sole owner and the sole doctor working in there. One last thing I'll ask about is transitions, and what are your thoughts on how to preserve the business as it goes through a transition from one owner OD to the next? What makes for a successful transition that keeps patients coming back, that preserves that profitability, that preserves the value of that business? What have you seen through your work and doing all those years of work for transitions?
So this is my favorite thing to do is work on practice acquisitions for doctors who want to blaze their own trail, become owners. And the first thing I tell them is when you're buying a practice, you're making a huge investment, right? You're making a financial investment. You're saying that I'm going to borrow $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 from the bank to buy this practice with the hopes of continuing to pay off that loan, grow it, so that in the 10, 15 years and I'm over 20 years, and then I shall have all this equity that I built out. So that's a huge financial investment. Another thing you're doing, you're blazing your own path. You're making a huge career investment, right? When you own a practice, it's like having a kid, right? It's you put a lot of time into it, sweat into it, tears into it to have it grow. And so, my job and the work I do with a client is to try to mitigate as much risk in this deal that we're going to have with the seller to protect ourselves and protect that investment so that you can be successful in the transaction. And there's different ways to do that to make sure that you're successful. One is, via the due diligence, to work with a consultant to go into the practice and evaluate from the inside, look at the financial numbers, look at the employees, the data, the practice software, and get comfortable that there's no kind of skeletons in the closet that you can't, that are going to be problematic for you, right? The second way is to have an attorney with experience in these type of deals review the agreements that you're going to sign and try to get as much risk there. So that's legal due diligence. That's including non-compete so that the seller doesn't, take these patients after he sold the practice to you, announce solicitation. Seller doesn't take the employees from the practice after it's been sold. And then it's a very human and emotional journey to work with a seller who's also going through a huge career change, right? Letting go of this
Yeah.
practice that he or she has owned for 20, 30 years, honoring that, not fighting over every little point in the deal to maintain that relationship. I always tell my buyers and sellers, you're going to come out of this thing one way or another, either, being really happy or fighting for everything, every dollar, and having a really bad relationship with the doctor who either just took over the practice or whose practice you just took over. You don't want to have that situation because that could really affect the transition and your success. So it's just, it's good to be mindful in these deals, to assess situations and not lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah. That's such a good point in terms of like the psychology of the seller. I've heard it explained like going through a period of mourning, when I've heard retirement explained in that way, but especially when you are selling this business that a lot of times you've built from scratch, right? There's a lot attached to that business and your identities in that. So that's such an interesting point about what the seller's going through as they're selling that. And on the end of that spectrum where things aren't as good in the relationship, I've got a few relationships where the buyers are having a really hard time after the purchase with the previous seller, and where the real estate's still involved and there was supposed to be a sale of the real estate, but it's not. So it's been a tough relationship afterwards. Unknown why, but there's definitely something that the seller is going through psychologically and just
What
behaviorally to like get through that transition.
One of the first questions I ask sellers is, what hobbies do you have? Because, like if they don't have anything else going outside their practice, selling their practice and retiring can be really difficult. And that can
Yeah.
be very difficult for themselves and the buyer. So, yeah, it's very difficult. If they don't have good team around them that's going to walk with them through the journey, this emotional journey. And it's true for the buyer's end as well. I always tell the buyers, when I talk in public in front of buyers, I did last weekend, I said, fear is the biggest thing that torpedoes a deal. And it's usually the anxiety of a fear of a buyer who has a lot of student loan debt, who's going to take out a big loan to buy a practice, who's unsure of herself or himself. And by the way, at the same time, they might be having a kid or getting married or having different life transition. And so it's all that fear that really, comes out in different ways and not reasonable ways that can really torpedo a deal. So, practice transitions are a big emotional journey, and you really got to be ready for it and have a team that's attuned to those things, and can talk to you about those things as you go through a deal.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to sort of wrap up here. And as we do you have any final last thoughts for just anyone thinking about protecting themselves from asset protection or protecting the value of their business? Any last thoughts you'd like to leave with the listeners?
Maybe less about the asset protection side and just maybe motivational. I started my practice in 2008 during the Great Recession. I saw COVID. I saw different ups and downs economically. We're going through a little bit of a one right now, and there's a lot of people out there who will catastrophize everything that's going on in the world and tell you it's a terrible time to do something. And I would just lead by saying that, you can't wait till everything's perfect to make a move. If you really want something, you got to kind of take life by the horns and give it a go. And we've survived a lot of economic up and downs. And for all the catastrophizing going on, the interest rates on insurance for practice purchases are incredibly low still historically. And the reason is that optometrists are an excellent bet for lenders.
Yeah.
And if lenders think that you're an excellent bet in terms of paying back their loan, you should have real confidence in yourself that if you want to become a practice owner or own a practice, you can do so. Because lenders certainly think that you can do so.
I love that. I love that. Levi, where can optometrists find and follow and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, so Pacific Health Law Group, we're located here in Los Angeles. You can look me up. My telephone number out here is 310-776-5384. And our website is pacifichealthlaw.com, and you can book an appointment with me on the website. I do free 15-minute consultations. I'm happy to talk to anyone about some of the legal issues they might be working on.
Well, I really appreciate your time. This was fun for me. I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. And we will put all of your information in the show notes, which anyone can find at the Education Hub at my website or by scrolling down, I believe, in whatever app you're using. But really appreciate your time today. And for the listener, appreciate you listening. We will catch you all on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.